Well, thanks, everyone. Sorry about that little delay of game, and I appreciate everyone coming to this conversation about leadership. Though I'm not surprised at the turnout, because Tom could not have given any more plugs to the importance of leadership in the last conversation. And I could not agree with him more. My name is Kathleen Enright. I'm the president and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. And I am thrilled to be joined by my three colleagues here, all of whom I've known for quite a long time. Linda Wood is from the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. Heather McLeod Grant, recently of Monitor Institute, but is also the author of a wonderful book called Forces for Good. And then Rick Moyers, who is from the Meyer Foundation in Washington, D.C. These are three people who are very committed to developing talent in the nonprofit sector. They know a lot about it. So we are all thrilled to be able to hear from them today. So, you know, the topic of leadership development is one that is near and dear to my heart. I've spent several years, much of my career has been connected to the content around leadership development. Before coming to GEO, I was with BoardSource, which is an organization in Washington that focuses on leadership and governance in the nonprofit sector. So our hope for today, please keep coming in, anybody, is to have a lively conversation. This is not going to be a situation where each of these people give 15 minutes worth of remarks and then we stop and you guys ask questions. We're going to carry through several themes. We're going to first talk about why leadership is important, what we as a field have learned over the past decade or more about what kinds of investments in leadership work. Then we're going to talk about some of the key challenges that just persist, you know, that are still with us when we think about nonprofit leadership development. We'll look at the next frontier. What are the different kinds of leaders we need, the different kind of skills we need to build for the world and the context that we live in right now. And then we'll try to bring it home. We have a lot of grant makers in this room, and this conversation is about, you know, how grant makers effectively support leadership. So we will talk about how you translate what we know, what the challenges are, into strategy and practice inside your own institutions. So with that said, I want to start, though, with all of you. This is a late in the afternoon session, so you're not going to get to just sit back and drink your coffee and do nothing. Sorry. I want to hear from you. What are some of the key things that we know, or the case for why leadership is excruciatingly important in our work as grant makers? And or what have you learned as you have gone through making grants, gone through supporting leaders, seen transitions, whatever? What have you learned about what works? So this is just open. Yes, good, Jim.
Jim Hart from Boeing. You know, this might just be particular to Southern California or Los Angeles, but in terms of diversity and just adding diverse voices to the leadership conversation was really important to us. And it kind of came clear. We were taking a site visit at Homeboy Industries, and I don't know, is everybody on Homeboy? And Joey Lucero was the Homeboy that was giving us the tour. He's this really dynamic, personable guy that, you know, was incarcerated for years and a gang member, but he kind of turned his life around. And he said something that just kind of sparked in my head the direction that our support for leadership would take, was that he sort of had that innate charismatic leadership ability, and the gang got to him first, because the gang could see that in him.
Interesting.
And so there's lots of people out there who have that innate leadership qualities, but don't get the chance to go to a private West Side secondary school, or don't get to go to college or an Ivy League school, that are left out of the conversation. And I think it's important for them to hear the conversations, but it's also important for, you know, traditional leadership in the city and in the region to hear these voices as well, and everybody get be able to speak the same language. So that's where our support has been, is really identifying these people, as we term it, who have had a unique path to leadership,
Well,
and giving them the tools and the network to operate.
to use their powers for good. And that's a point Kat made in the opening session as well, is that leadership can emerge from a variety of places, some of them that you wouldn't suspect. So someone over here, was that you, sir? Yes.
Yeah. I had it's somewhat related, but I think there is often a challenge that grant makers like charisma and visionary leaders, but we expect management. And so, in the way, I think it's interesting that in the arts, it's recognized, the idea of having an artistic director and a managing director, and I'm not trying to oversimplify it,
No,
it's sort of as a recognized practice. But a lot of what happens, I think, is the visionary, the charismatic leader is what gets funded, what attracts the attention, but that's not, but then the grant makers are concerned about the sustainability, leadership development, what comes with that, and I think that is a very big challenge, both in terms of bringing diversity and more people into the leadership role.
Right.
Also, I think we expect two different skill sets, and we actually fund one way and expect another.
And how many organizations have COOs and CEOs in our small nonprofits, right? They just can't afford that a lot of times. Yeah, Hugh.
I think one of the interesting challenges the sector is grappling with is what I would call sort of the dilemma of collective leadership. We focus on leaders, and for all the reasons that have just been talked about. And I don't think any living human being ever actually fulfilled all the requirements in a job description. So we usually try and find 60%, declare victory, and move on. But the other element, which obviously may reflect my day job, is that there are other elements to successful organizational leadership at the board level, stakeholders, and I'm not sure we do as good a job, even whether we're talking with charismatic or management leaders, to figure out how to build those collective leadership skills, which in my faith tradition is called servant leadership, and is actually pretty critical to success. And so I think there are multiple layers to that successful nonprofit leadership, and it is beyond, I think, the specific skills of the leader that we need to think about, and which we've been wrestling in our nonprofit.
I could not agree with you more, and Hugh just made the perfect transition into a couple remarks that I was going to make just to ground us in what we actually have learned as a field over the past decade. There's still plenty more to learn, but about 5 or 6 years ago, GEO did a series of publications called Investing in Leadership. And we drew from examples of grant makers who had been supporting leadership intentionally as a capacity building strategy for at least 3 years. So we didn't want to learn from someone who had just started doing something. We wanted to learn from folks who had been trying and toiling and had made some of those adjustments and had figured out what works and what doesn't work. And both the Haas Junior Fund and the Meyer Foundation were key exemplars in that research 6 years ago, and clearly their work has continued to evolve and get more sophisticated over time. So I wanted to just say quickly the 3 things we learned about leadership, investments in leadership development that ultimately build organizational performance. So we're not talking about just the mountaintop experience for one ED. We're talking about how do we prepare the leaders in this institution to help lead the organization, to a better end. At the time, we looked at, I think it was 40 different grant makers who were doing quite different things related to leadership development. Some of them were doing more discrete programs. Some of them, it was almost the entire focus of their work. And when we culled through the practices and we culled through the decisions that they had made and then kind of rolled back, they'd changed their minds, what we saw were sort of 3 primary characteristics of those programs that were ultimately about organizational performance improvement. The first one, Hugh, was that it was collective. So you set me up quite well. I said that it's not about just plucking out one individual and giving them an opportunity for personal growth or for self-actualization or even for skills training, you have to think about all of the people inside an organization, volunteer leaders, paid staff, any others that are key contributors who need to be involved in the leadership of the organization and work with those folks collectively. This might take the form of having board and staff teams come together to a series of training programs. We've even seen, and Claire's in the room, aren't you? Claire, where are you? Maybe she didn't come. She snuck out. So I saw her come in. Claire Peeps, who runs the Durfee Foundation, was one of the examples we looked at back then. They take a collective approach to their sabbatical program, which that seems a little counterintuitive, but and this is something they learned along the way, they were giving sabbaticals to these execs, and then the execs were coming back, and they'd had this self-actualization, and then they'd leave their job because they decided that was really too hard, and that's not what they were going for, right? So what they ended up doing is shifting it so that they got the board bought in on the front end. They they helped pay a little bit more to the people who were left behind to do the work, and they gave those people a coach so that when the ED came back, when the executive director came back, it was a different role. They had other people inside the organization who were lifting more of the load. And it turned out to be the exact kind of experience that they were going for. So that's collective. The second, there are 3 C's, so for easy memory. The second one is about leadership development being continuous. And as a nonprofit executive myself, when I think about trying to build for the future, trying to think about what the organization ultimately needs to be, yes, there are little training programs that are a part of it. People need to get the skills that that are required to do the job. But really, it's about a philosophical approach. It's a culture that encourages and rewards leadership development. And so continuous means it just can't be, leadership cannot be built in a half-day short course. That was one of the lessons that many of the grant makers who were involved in this work learned. And the third one is contextual. And so one of the early mistakes that funders that reported to us made was that it was sort of like, well, we have this, so let's offer it. We built it, so please y'all come, meaning they would offer programming that was not contextualized to the particular needs and particular interests of those grantees. So even among your grantees, there are folks who are highly sophisticated, and there are folks who are kind of just coming up. So typically, they're not going to need the same stuff. So leadership development that considers context is typically the support that's most effective. So that was very quick because I want to get to these folks, but we wanted to ground in just some of the basics of what we've learned over time. And before we get to the full panel discussion, I wanted Linda to just say a couple words, if you don't mind, about the Flexible Leadership Award, because when we were looking at these examples, we found several who were, several examples of work that foundations were doing that were collective and continuous and contextual in just the way that that we heard was most effective. So, Linda.
So, just really briefly, the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund is San Francisco-based, and we were created by descendants of Levi Strauss. And we work in the area of civil rights and education equity. And so as Kathleen said, we developed this program that does have these characteristics: continuous, contextual, collective. Basically, when we were starting the program, we saw a lot of leadership development programs where they would identify leaders with the idea, and then create a program for them with the idea that they would go back and create strong organizations that were advancing some kind of goals. That was kind of the general gist of what a lot of funders were funding and leadership development program providers were offering. And we kept thinking, well, what if we just flip that on its head and start with the social change impact, or the impact that we're interested in as a foundation, and then identify the organizations that are really critical for making that impact real, and and offer them the opportunity to develop their leadership. So the Flexible Leadership Awards program was born of that idea. The way it works is, like I said, you know, we happen to fund in the area of gay and lesbian rights and lifting the voices of immigrants in the state. Those are two areas that we work in. So we identified, and we have goals, and I could talk about that, but we identified the groups that were most critical for advancing that work, and then offered them the opportunity to work with a consultant. We wanted to have a little bit of a firewall to really to answer really simple questions like, where are you trying to go 3 years out? What's the kind of leadership that you need to get there? So this is a little bit away from the ED heroic, ED-centric model. And how are you going to build that? So what's the leadership you need? What does the ED need to step up to if you're really going to get there? What would the board need to do if they're going to get there? How might you actually need to change the way you're structured and led in order to achieve what you're trying to achieve? And they put together a year plan. They're looking 3 years out, but they put together a year plan and package that with consultant support, coaching, et cetera. And then that comes to us, to me as the program officer, and then we fund that work. So that's sort of how we kind of, it's contextual in the sense that they're really looking at their particular role vis-a-vis other groups. And what they're trying to accomplish. It's continuous because we're providing long-term support, at least 3 years of funding. And it's collective. Only 10% of all of our grant funds actually fund direct support to the executive director. It's senior team, it's board development, and that sort of thing.
Yep, it's a great example. Well, so. Really quickly, I wanted to ask you guys if there was anything else about what we've learned that you wanted to add, anything about why leadership is so important to your work before we move on to the next conversation.
I wanted, if we could have a parking lot.
Okay.
If we were to come to the end of the session and we were to happen to have
Look, there's a big parking lot right here.
5 or 10 minutes where we could just have a free-for-all discussion about anything we wanted. I would like to talk about this idea of the visionary leader who's not a good manager, and whether that is a real thing or a false thing, because I actually believe that there are people who do both of those things very well, and this idea that we have to trade one or the other, I don't think is right. But that's off topic for the session. But
okay,
so
it's in the,
if we have
at
time.
GEO we call it the bike rack.
I'd be happy to talk about it a little bit.
But we're in LA, so it should be the parking lot.
Touche.
Sorry. Mean. I live in Chicago, you know, it's too cold to bike there, Robin.
I would be interested, if we have time.
Oh, now we're creating a whole thing.
To understand or get some ideas on how we can strengthen leadership in organizations as a funder when your funding area is not in the area of leadership development. And I ask that because we fund year over year, so we're building long-term relationships with these organizations, and we can see the flaws, but we don't fund leadership, we fund leadership.
I think we're going to handle that. I don't even think that goes in the bike rack. I think that we're actually going to talk about that. But I think we're going to handle that in the final section of, you know, making it real, if you don't mind. We'll just put it to the side for 1 second, but we're definitely going to get to that, Robin. Well, I guess we'll just move to the next
You know, I would like to say
sure.
one really quick thing. So one of the things I've noticed in, well, in philanthropy in general, because I came from both nonprofit and corporate sector, but is that there's this great need to evaluate this work, and people funders will often say that a barrier to them being able to do this is not so much that, but can you show, you know, what the impact of the leadership investments? And so, and because in the corporate sector, this is so, of course you cultivate leadership of your people, and there's all sorts of actually very good reasons why that doesn't happen in our sector. But as a result, we have all along the way, because we do have a portfolio developed, focused on this, and we know that many people in philanthropy don't. We made this real commitment to evaluate. And so I just want to say that we did, we work with this guy at Harvard. We've spent a lot of time on this, and we did show that investments in leadership strengthen the achievement of strategic goals. And if you want our study that shows that, I'm sure you could poke many holes at it, but that I think is sometimes can be a barrier, and there are some of us in the space who have spent a lot of time really kind of showing that these kind of investments are worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree with Linda's point more, and I think I see it sort of in the category of, if you don't like the results of a study, you poke holes in the methodology. That's what pundits do all the time. It feels like that to me a little bit. Like, where's the evidence that investments in leadership work? Feels like a kind of a more convenient excuse for not doing it, rather than something that's really necessary and important. Particularly because in the corporate sector, no one requires that kind of evidence on the front end, and there are already studies in other places of how it does work. And Gio's actually compiling those, so we'll be able to give anyone the ammunition they need for whoever it is that's asking that question of them. Great. So I wanted to transition into, so we've been talking about the importance of leadership and what we've learned over the past 10 years about what works, 10 or so years. And I just want to talk a little bit about what's hard and what's persistently hard, and where we're still kind of grappling and struggling. And so I'm going to ask all of the panelists to contribute, but Rick, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Well, when we had the call to prepare for this, maybe it's because I had so much to say at that moment in the call. I think that in general, when funders support leadership development programs, I think that there's a failure to take into account kind of what other organizational factors are affecting that leader's ability to be a good leader and to take the organization to the next level. I like to call this I hope you enjoyed your week at Harvard. Oh, by the way, your paycheck bounced.
Yeah.
Kind of
phenomenon
of you can, it goes with what is good leadership development. You can take people and send them somewhere and have them learn things and give them money for a coach or whatever, but at the end of the day, if they come back into the same organization and it still is in this resource starvation cycle that most nonprofits are in, I don't see how you can expect that investment to be effective. The second thing I think is that I think that sometimes there's a disconnect between what funders or what I believe might be good for leaders and what leaders actually want or need. And sometimes they don't know what they want or need. But I feel like sometimes there's this other place that is probably neither, what they might not know what they need, but the thing that I think they need might not be the thing that they need. And I'm always struck by the fact that these are, my whole relationship, if I'm a program officer, with these people is based on seeing them, I don't know, on average 1 or 2 hours a year and reading a bunch of paperwork that they send to me. And on my worst days, I wake up and think, really, who am I to make a judgment about this person as a leader and what they might need in terms of leadership development based on such a superficial level of interaction with them? I believe in Malcolm Gladwell and Blink and all that, but really just a 1 hour meeting and suddenly I know what kind of leadership development this leader might need. And when you do this work for many years, Linda and I have both been in our jobs for about 10 years. I can think back on times when we were snowed, when we got burned on a leader, when I would have told you that person was, was a visionary, public, external leader who was going to take the organization to the next level, and that turned out not to be the case at all. So I think that it's important that we go into this work with a sense of humility and kind of the knowledge that our powers are limited, and sometimes we're not as smart as we think we are. And I'll stop there and let
Important
Linda
stuff.
or Heather add.
And I want anyone else in the room to add or challenge or make whatever comment comes up. So please just raise your hand at any minute. Do not wait for me to ask. David, look at that.
You do.
Uh-huh.
No, because I think that's exactly, one of the things that we're seeing out there is, and these are great, 25% of organizations here in California, 30 days of cash or less.
David works for the Nonprofit Finance Fund, if anyone
You're
was
also
wondering.
just pandering to me because you know this is my favorite
I
topic.
know. And so, yeah, you think about what's their life like, right?
Yeah.
Are they thinking about what's the long-term strategic direction of the organization? No, they're trying to
Payroll.
stop the checks from bouncing. They're coming in on Saturday to see if that check arrives, and they're doing these things. And when we start to think down, like, what is their day-to-day life, given, particularly for, groups that are heavily government funded, that are seeing all the funding going away. So I think that aspect of the other organizational pieces and that leadership development cannot be a standalone piece without thinking about, you're right, just what are you sending right back into?
Yeah, the context that they're in, absolutely. Lois, for you?
Oh, I just was going to say, I can't agree with you more. I think it's been kind of this trend in our community from Santa Barbara, but the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a lot of grant makers investing in all this sort of leadership development, but I'm not hearing the voice from the nonprofits enough to say, yeah, well, that's not really what we need. It's sort of hurting a lot because it's being paid for an office plan. Instead of everyone really saying, tell us exactly what we need for down to that level. And I just,
Well, and they're afraid not to go because they're afraid that you're taking attendance and will hold it against them if they don't go.
Well, and it goes a little bit, your point, Lois, goes a little bit to an answer that I would give to Robin's question, which is, well, first of all, it's about the conversation, right? It's about understanding from them what they need and talking with them about what you can do to be supportive. But another piece is general operating support, because if you've got flexible dollars, they can invest in whatever the heck their priorities are, and hopefully one of their priorities is to invest in their people.
Yeah, so I wanted to jump in on this point because I think I bring a bit of the nonprofit voice into the room. I'm actually not a funder funding these programs, although I have huge respect for all of the work of these folks. I have your report right here. But a lot of my work and research has been working with social entrepreneurs and leaders of nonprofit organizations, folks really working on the ground in the trenches and increasingly in community-based leadership programs. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and it's the challenge that GEO has tried to address and the whole capacity building field has tried to take on, is this pernicious kind of myth of overhead, and that somehow investing in people, talent, IT, systems, the infrastructure and the capabilities that are required to execute and implement high-quality programs that get you to social impact, I still think we're fighting that battle. When I go out and talk a lot about forces for good, and we mentioned this in our chapter, and I can get up on my soapbox, but I think one of the most consistent things I hear is that especially, perhaps less amongst the enlightened foundations, but especially amongst individual donors, they're still looking at overhead ratios as the metric of success as opposed to looking at what's the organization's impact. And if we need to invest in helping train up and develop the capacity of not just our AD, but our board, our senior teams. So I still think that's a real issue in the field from the nonprofit point of view.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important point. Helen.
I just want to echo what Kathleen said. At the Weinberg Foundation 4 years ago, we instituted core operating support, and it was in response to the downturn to help established organizations just help maintain and sustain. But what we saw happening about midway, so about 2 years ago, and this is unrestricted funding, but the conversation, even from the very beginning of introducing CORE, was always about the organization. Tell us what your organizational needs are. It moved away from the program focus, which I think just still most funders hone in on, and that's why we get these requests and these LOIs that focus in on programs and outcomes and serving X number, because that's what we have taught them to do. But what happened along the way is that for some of those organizations who, for lack of a better word, had begun to stabilize their organization, what they were then telling us is that they were using some of our grant funding to help either build back some lost capacity, or in some cases, they had the opportunity to step back, and it's called, basically they were using this as working capital. So we decided to kind of take step back and take a look. So this came from them. We started to see this. There was an external evaluator who was assessing kind of how our grant making was evolving and moving along. And so now we are very intentional. So it goes to your point, Kathleen. It's about the conversation. And it's about sitting with them and telling us, from an organizational perspective, from a financial perspective, and yes, from your programs, but really we're interested in strengthening your organization. And how would you? You could use this money in any way. Invest in that, and we're finding that they're using it in a number of ways to help build and strengthen their capacity, board development, staff development. It just goes on and on and on. So again, this is fairly new for us, but that's what we're learning, and we're continuing to try to learn more about that. And I just think that what we're seeing and hearing is that nonprofits think that providing the unrestricted support is the best way, but it has to begin with the conversation.
Yep. And and Linda actually posted a really interesting listserv message to the GEO listserv a couple weeks ago about that very question, which is, is general operating support actually the best way to fund leadership development, or is restricted money for leadership development the best way to do it? And I would say that I think that the answer came out, it depends, right? That there are very compelling reasons to give direct project support for leadership development, and in certain institutions that are going to prioritize it, general operating support is clearly the right way.
Yeah, I was just trying to make the point that, first of all, we do a lot of general operating support funding in our regular programs. The point I was trying to make is that still in our sector, there is a culture that it's a luxury. And whether it's about, nonprofit, finance, or if it's about, fundraising strategy, or, what's considered more the hard stuff, or it's, coaching to balance internal and external roles, change your board, any of that stuff. If it's about, for yourself, spending money on yourself, diverting money from the mission, invest in yourself, even though you're the most important asset of an organization, it is excruciatingly difficult, if not impossible, for many, at least the small groups, a lot of the small groups we have to make that choice. And so to sometimes just giving people the permission to spend money on themselves and not program can be really valuable.
Yep.
I actually think it's one of the most important roles that a foundation can play, although this is one of those arrogant things that foundations say. It's like how valuable our conversation was. But I do think that when we sit across from a grantee and we give them permission to think about spending money on board development or executive coaching, it's an important thing for the organization, and it helps change the way they think about the possibilities for what they could do with our investment.
I couldn't agree with that more. Any other comments on this? Yes.
Hi, so I'm a bit of a retired or recovering grant maker. Okay. I've been on the board of a foundation.
That's good. I had to make sure it was Fran.
and now I consult with a lot of organizations. And I think the issues that we're raising have a lot to do with how organizations develop resilience and survival, and the lessons that we need to learn from their practice. The other way in which I'm probably a traitor to my class is that I think that those organizations can teach other organizations better than we can in some ways about survival, and that if I were to ever be a grant maker again, I think I would look differently at opportunities to empower organizations by helping them to earn income that allows them to to support other organizations, particularly, I mean, we're very place-based oriented in some ways. You're sitting in the middle of the place.
Yes, of course.
South already, Figueroa Park, this one building like a community center, balance places. And so there are enormous resources here that we're completing in the technical assistance division. And I think if we look at it from a strengths-based approach, looking at organizations that have developed resilience and survived over time in these clients, that we can learn and help them share.
Yep. Indigenous resources are plenty, I am sure.
We just don't pay for them.
Exactly. We don't pay for them. We don't give them the time and space to share. Someone else over here had a hand up, and I didn't remember who it was. Oh, it was you. Okay, sorry.
When you were talking about somebody from the nonprofit sector, I'm at the Center for Nonprofit Management. I have a lot of feelings about this. And one of the things that I think I hear you struggling with is realistic expectations. And one of the things that we hear lately from EDs is it's hard to tell you what they need.
Funders. It's hard for nonprofits to tell funders, yeah.
And that when there is a leadership development program, the measurable objectives are too short. What can transform in 12 months? What will we see that's different in 2 years? And we all know these things are complicated. They take time to really stick.
Yeah.
That it usually has layers. And, you know, to sort of be able to move out the deadlines a bit, to give people time to let it percolate and then really hold.
Yeah.
And to your point, you know, to even when the choice is lay somebody off or go hire a coach, which is what, you know, everybody's been dealing with the last couple of years, we can, you know, have a little sympathy for the really hard conversations. And the piece to Glenn's point is what I don't think has been happening as much from my perch is listening.
By the funders.
Yeah. I think that there have been a lot of solutions that are prescriptive.
Yeah.
And what we're hearing from the folks that have been through some of that is not really helpful.
Yeah.
And they'll do it because they have to make the funders happy.
Yeah, that is.
They'd like to be heard.
That is not what we're going for, right? And my presumption is that the folks who are providing opportunities that are not meeting the needs of the hopes that they're hoping to serve don't want to do that either, right? That's not, you know, it's not their intent, but somehow they haven't built in the right kind of feedback loops or the right kind of, or enabled a relationship that allows for candid, hey, you know, I'm sure that was helpful to some, wasn't helpful to me for these 3 reasons. All right, I want to transition us right after your comment to the next section.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie with Bank of America, and since 2004, we've provided a $200,000 grant multi-year in core operating support to our neighborhood builders. It is one of the programs that I'm particularly proud of, but what we found is that when we send executive directors and emerging leaders to these trainings across the U.S., to everyone's point, it's less about the content of the workshop, but giving them topics to talk amongst each other about. So it's really that peer learning and exchange approach that's been so valuable to nonprofits. And I know we have a winner, sorry if I embarrassed you, that has received it last year and will be going through this training. But they come back and they say what was invaluable was the fact that we got to talk to each other for once. And we've got to see what each other does across the nation. We don't have the luxury to travel around and just take that moment in time to learn from each other. So it's less about us providing them with the training and more about, as a convener, bringing them together to solve issues in their nonprofits and in their organizations on their own and keep them connected.
Yeah, that are shared. And that goes a little bit to Fran's point, right? That the people who've been through it are those that have the most to share. So I want to move on a little bit to what, you know, we're in kind of a brave new world, right? We've been through multiple economic crises. Organizations are doing their work in profoundly different ways with different sets of partners. And so I wanted to ask Heather to talk a little bit about, what are the skills that nonprofit leaders need now in order to be able to be successful in the environment that we are currently in?
Yeah, and I'm going to speak a little bit to some of the trends I'm seeing.
Great.
As well in the field. So just to help frame this, just as Linda said a little bit about the Haas Fund, I just want to provide some perspective on kind of the lens I'm bringing to this conversation. So I spent probably 20 plus years in the social entrepreneurship movement, focused on scaling social impact, and as part of that wrote Forces for Good, and then was with Monitor Institute the better part of the last 5 years. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how you scale social impact. And in Forces for Good, one of our big ahas was it's as much about changing systems as it is about running programs. So it's about working across sectors and advocating and working with business. And 3 of our chapters in that book really dealt with some of the issues that I've heard you touch on, sharing leadership. So how do you actually think about leadership as a team sport within an organization? Not just the ED, but the board, the senior team, really seeing leadership as a strategic lever for having greater social impact and taking it seriously and investing in it. Adaptation, so how organizations become resilient and can survive through difficult times. I'm going to call out Marianne Haverhill because she's here from MIND. I recently spoke at an event of theirs back in December, and they were a case study in our local Forces for Good chapter where we looked at local nonprofits that had survived and even thrived during the downturn. And part of their story is about sharing leadership, how they've built an amazing board, how they've shared leadership internally, how they've engaged their evangelists and volunteers in the community and used that to survive. So in this journey, I think part of my shift has been shifting from the lens of organizational management and leadership to networks and collective leadership and collective impact. So as I've seen this shift in my practice through a lot of the work we did at Monitor Institute in partnership with GEO and other organizations, I think that's one of the big trends I'm really seeing in the field, and it's how I'm sort of pivoting in terms of my own work. So this next chapter in my own career, I'm going to be focusing on working in the Central Valley, where I'm from originally, Fresno, and a program funded by the Irvine Foundation that isn't even officially launched yet. But it's the Irvine Leadership Network, and it's looking at place-based approaches to social change. So creating networks of leaders, very much modeled on the Barr Foundation, the Barr Fellows Program, the American Leadership Forum, for some of those models that some of you may have heard about. I'm also working with an organization called Fuse Corps that's trying to promote civic innovators, like a White House Fellowship type program where they're taking top talent and placing talent in communities to work with mayors and governors and community-based organizations. And a group called Catalyst Corps that's looking at board members who see governance as leadership and are taking some of those principles. If you think about the whole social entrepreneurship movement, we focused a lot on the social entrepreneurs, and we focused a lot on the ideas and the innovations and getting them to scale. Boards are a critical piece of this picture. So I think in some ways, investing in the board leadership piece is a critical missing piece. So in terms of the trends I'm seeing in the field and sort of from the perspective of nonprofits and communities, I think we are in a world where it's a world of both and. It's not either or. Organizations are not going to go away. We're going to still need nonprofits. We're going to need strong, healthy nonprofits who can invest in their capacity. But we also need to be thinking about how do these nonprofits in ecosystems, often place-based ecosystems, work together and form networks, whether it's communities of practice for peer learning or it's action-oriented networks for getting things done, much like Strive or the REAMP network or some of these collective impact models you may have heard about or read about. I think we're also moving from a world where we're just looking at program replication and program delivery to systems change and really thinking about what is it going to take to change systems. And as part of that, this cross-sector piece is really critical. Fuse Corps talks about tri-sector athletes. It was one of the themes in Forces for Good. But again and again, I keep coming back to, and you all know this as smart philanthropists, nonprofits can't do it alone. Funders can't do it alone. We have to be figuring out how we're engaging government and how we're engaging the private sector, right, in the context of place, because these are critical pieces of that systems change point of view. And then lastly, I guess, again, from my point of view, from having spent 15, 20 years thinking about how do we go big, how do we become the next Teach for America, the next Habitat for Humanity, to thinking about how do we go deep, right? Let's not just focus on going big. That's great if you've got an amazing model and you can bring it into new communities, by all means do it. But how do we take the assets that are already in place and begin to mobilize those assets around solving some of these problems in communities? So I'm going to just stop there in terms of my some of my current thinking, but there are lots of resources out there. I just got a copy of June Hawley's book on network weaving. There are case studies. Bridgespan's been writing about this. You guys have been writing about this. So, I just think these are some of the important things to be emphasizing when you as funders are thinking about where and how you place your investments. I would think of it as a portfolio approach or a layering approach. You need to keep funding programs. You need to fund organizational leadership. And you increasingly need to fund collective impact and collective leadership programs that are looking at forming these networks.
That's great. I'm just going to see if either of you guys have building comments before I look out to the audience.
I guess through our program where we're focused on our leadership program where we're focused on organizations, I think that what we see is that there's kind of internal challenges to working in more networked ways. Of course, in our work, it's coalitions and alliances and networks of advocates. There are internal challenges in these organizations, and then there are external challenges. So the internal, the external ones are about, in immigrant communities across the state, they're not, organizations are not really connected. They don't really know each other. There have been funder-driven efforts to try to create coalitions that have completely failed. And a missing ingredient has been that they actually know each other, that they trust each other, that they haven't inherited the conflicts of their predecessors that they had nothing to do with. And so one of the ways that we have worked on that is by helping to seed fund, and now there's some other funders engaged, fellowship that just both strengthens the individual leaders across the state, but also helps them build relationships of trust, since collaboration depends on it. So now I'm sort of contradicting maybe some of the things that are said before about, it's just this soft stuff and they really need the hard stuff. But when it comes to networks and collaboration, they really do need to know each other, know their work, and trust each other. So I think that's a real external, that's one of the things I see groups struggling with. The second thing is just coming up with different structures to collaborate. So for example, there's some groups that want to work together in very deep ways, but they don't want to merge. It's not really a strategic alliance, but they want to maybe collaborate so that they're not replicating some back office stuff that has to do with advocacy, maybe a lobbyist in Sacramento, that sort of thing, but they don't want to merge. And so trying to help them come up with structures that work where they stay as separate nonprofits, but they have a way of working together. So those are external challenges that these individual nonprofit, our grantees are really struggling with. And then internally, it's all of a sudden the executive director has a lot on his or her plate, and they're balancing these internal and external roles, and all of a sudden there are many different tables they're supposed to show up at, trying to figure out which ones are the right ones, and trying to do that with a heroic ED, everything's, they're making most of the decisions, doesn't work. So a lot of times the internal work is helping them create a senior team so the executive director can play these external roles. And helping the boards understand that they might fundraise for this other entity instead of just their own organization. Or helping the boards understand they may be ceding some strategic authority, to that entity rather than completely owning it for their own organization. You know what I mean? So I think that, as groups, I think groups have always worked in networks. I mean, we've come from a civil rights movement, a lot of different movements. Groups have always worked in networks, but there seems to be a heightened, I think the next generation of leaders is just more wired that way, and they're kind of bumping up against some of the ways that, boomers and the rest of us have kind of created this sector. So we really, are helping the groups with these internal and external challenges. And it's not always obvious how to, but we're trying to.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like for the moment that we're in right now, yes, organizations are important, but so given all the size of all the problems that we're trying to address and the work that we're trying to do, there needs to be sort of more permeability between our walls, right? So the way that I tend to think about it is about putting the mission or the work in the middle rather than putting the institution in the middle, right? Because sometimes you make decisions because who's going to get the money and how's that going to be administered or what's that going to mean for my organizational policies, and that's what boards are key. That's what they're genetically programmed to focus on, right? Is their institutional fiduciary responsibility. But I think we're going to need to get more flexible about how we think about moving big pieces of complex work forward in ways that enable joint action and that break down some of those barriers of ego and institutional needs. No one on this side has said much in this entire conversation. And I moved over here, so just in case you were raising your hand and I didn't see you.
This is not to devalue you or your contribution to the conversation.
We have our Boeing guy.
Jim had said something before, and he'll take another one for the left side
for the team.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about leadership development programs, the ones that we support have a strong networking component to it. That needs to be in any leader's wheelhouse, is their Rolodex, is their network. And multiple networks, not just who is the other ED in the same type of organization that I do, but those in the private sector, those in the governmental sector. I mean, I look at some of the really great nonprofit leaders in Los Angeles, and they are so well connected in so many different areas. And that's what we want to try and develop in the leaders that we're looking at. I've heard a lot about sort of, engaging the board, engaging the executive director, the executive team. Would anybody like to talk about how deep down can you go? I mean, we've looked at...
You mean into like junior staff, is that what you're talking about?
Program
staff.
Programmatic leaders, development staff.
Well,
any experience with that?
I mean, this just starts to touch on the topic of talent development more broadly, right? Not just leadership development, which we tend to think of as being a slightly higher level function, but, I mean, I think, when you look at the best nonprofit organizations, I think their leadership development is really oriented around building a leadership pipeline. And I would say many of the high impact nonprofits and Forces for Good, both the national, global, and the locals, have that mindset around talent being really strategic. I know there's an initiative being run now called the Talent Initiative, looking at this in the nonprofit sector. But I think a classic example, perhaps cliched at this point, but Teach for America. I mean, they really are world class in the sense of how they think about teachers, how they recruit, how they place. They sort of borrowed from the best of the McKinseys and the, Wall Street banks recruiting on campuses, but then folks go into the classroom, they do, their 2 years, some of them stay, some of them leave, but those that leave, that's their talent pipeline for then elevating those folks into more junior level local management positions. From the local sites, they're then pulling people up into more senior level leadership positions, finally at headquarters. And so, and if you want to talk about a charismatic leader who's also probably one of the most disciplined analytic managers I know, Wendy Kopp's a great example, right? So I think you can have both and, not always. I think sometimes you need to think about, okay, this person's really charismatic and visionary, and this person, the COO, is going to run the nuts and bolts of the organization. But I think there is a need to really be thinking in terms of human systems and talent pipelines, and those are longer-term funding plays. Those are not 2-year program plays; those are 10-year plays. I mean, I just spent a year working with Hillel, just to take an example, a national Jewish organization, looking at how they engage peer networks and students on college campuses. And then starting to think about how do they build a leadership pipeline for the whole field of Jewish institutions and philanthropy. So it's thinking about that larger systems point of view, and it is getting outside of the sometimes it's within the organizational lens, and sometimes it's within a whole field or network lens, and thinking about how talent moves through. I think corporations like GE and IBM and Google and Facebook have the benefit of having the scale where they can, they're growing fast enough that they can raise the talent up within their organization. I think in the nonprofit sector, many organizations are small, so people have to make lateral moves. And right now, there aren't really great platforms or systems in place for young people thinking about how they build their careers and what those leadership pipelines look like in our sector.
But those of us in leadership positions in the nonprofit sector, if more folks take the perspective of sort of tending to the commons, right? Developing leaders who maybe can't stay at GEO for their whole career because we're only a 20-person organization and there might not be that next level up when they're ready for it. But we're going to do our best to make those opportunities available to them when they're there. But then we're going to, you know, kind of send them off to be really great folks somewhere else. And that's, I think we all kind of need to be a little bit more magnanimous about the leadership that we're building, that it's not just for us, that it's for our sector, our movement, our field. Did I say something controversial? Everyone just...
Well, I just want to say we're a little, well, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but we don't fund leadership development. We tend to not fund it for the whole organization. We have very limited funds, and we're really focused on boards and senior leadership teams. And or senior leaders if they don't have a team yet, or not big enough, because and there are, we feel like it's really important because at that second tier there are lots of leaders of color at that second tier. If we're developing those folks to, you know, expand the leadership that they are taking up for the organization, that's part of working on the pipeline. But I mean, we have very limited funds, so we actually don't go as. And if they create something of a culture inside their organizations, they naturally start to think about how they're bringing people up in the organization.
That makes sense.
To go back to the philanthropic context, though, I think it's a hard sell to our board. I think to our board to say, it's easy for me to say we know that executive directors are really important. We know that we can make an investment in this executive director and maybe the senior management team, and within a few years the organization will be significantly stronger. As opposed to, we would like to invest in talent development for the sector writ large. We have no idea where these people may end up someday, but we're just going to invest in it, assuming that it goes well. And it's already been alluded to. The problem, there's a structural problem in the sector of when you're investing in talent development for your younger staffers, you're investing in talent development for someone else's organization at some point in the future. And I think it just makes it much more difficult.
I think one of the tasks that we've taken at an organization I worked with, the way they looked at it was, you know, it wasn't such a bad thing for people to say, you know, for there to be a time when it was recognized that all this talent came from their organization. That, you know, that if you wanted to go and hire a good ED, you look for somebody who had XYZ organization on their resume because you knew that they were really developed well. And it created, you know, as those people left, more people were drawn to try and get positions.
Well,
in that
just one
space.
point, and I know Marianne had her hand up.
Sorry.
Okay, go ahead. Well, yeah, okay. And you'll come back
It's
to
not going to be that
Marianne,
meaningful of a question, but to pull back for a second, there's 20 or 30,000 charities in LA County. There's close to 1 million charities in the United States. There's over 50,000 new charities being formed every year. Legally, you have to have a board of directors, as we all know, on a charity. So it gets to this really, to me, much broader question. Is that really possible? If you just look at board leadership, forget about executive team, is it really possible to build these many boards with these many dynamic leaders? And I think if you start taking a look at the real macro and you pull out of the micro, you got to ask the bigger questions of what the reality is. And I know somebody said something about, you know, collaborations or strategic alliances, but at some point, what are the possibilities that you really are creating an infrastructure that can support philanthropy in general and actually do some real good and solve some problems?
You have to cherry pick.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an efficient way to design a system, right? I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on innovation, and there's not as much interest in getting the really best organizations to scale. And I think, you know, the field is starting to have, in the last 4 years especially, an honest and hard conversation about the role of mergers, the role of shared infrastructure, backbone organizations, right? All of that, the ways that you stop duplicating lots and lots of overhead for teeny tiny organizations, none of which are ever going to solve the problem at scale. Networks are one way to do that, but there are other solutions as well.
Well, just at the risk of saying that no one wants to hear, I think we need to stop throwing around those huge numbers and trying to use them as a case for encouraging more mergers, because there aren't really more than 1 million nonprofits in the U.S. except on paper. So that's...
But there's still lots of, if you look at the budget size, like 90% of nonprofits operate on less than $1 million budget. So there are lots and lots of fragmented, tiny, small organizations, very few of which are solving the problem at scale.
But Heather, most of which, to Rick's point, most of which just got their IRS 501c3, and then they kind of operated for, you know, a year and a half, and then they don't exist anymore, and nobody filed their dissolution papers. Is that mainly your point, Rick?
No.
No. Oh my goodness.
I think we're going.
I just take issue in a very friendly and collegial way with the idea that everything, I don't know, that nonprofits ought to be more like Walmart. That I can think of many, many, many $600,000 organizations that are doing a really great job at the thing that they need to be doing that don't need to be any bigger.
Yeah. And there are some that are really small and some that are really big that are not having much impact.
Yes.
All right, so I am now transitioning us really quickly. I'm sorry.
Can Marianne say her comment? It was on the
I am losing the control of this situation. And I actually am usually quite a strong moderator, and I cannot whip y'all into shape.
We flew here to be on this panel.
She did have her hand up, and she's from the left side of the room.
Marianne. Well, I just wanted to kind of refer back to the whole idea of networks and refer back to a comment about how executive directors need to be engaged and they should relieve them of other duties so they can do all this networking and blah, blah, blah. And that's what's really going to move their organization forward. And I guess I run a multi-service poverty relief agency. So we have a really large emergency food bank and a clothing distribution center, and we have medical, dental, and vision clinics for uninsured patients, and we have an education training program. So those are our big programs. But several years ago, when we were doing our strategic plan, I guess we've taken the position that we don't have the corner on solving poverty, that there's a whole lot of other people that also would like to make a difference for the poor, and how can we welcome them in? So in this plan, we strategically said we are going to develop collaborations with other organizations and partner with them in doing this. And we set very small metrics. We just wanted to do a few in each department, see how. Well, when we added up our list last summer of collaborations, we had 312. Now, I could not manage 312 collaborations. And granted, some of them are, much looser than others that are very structured with signed agreements and funding and all that. I mean, it's a real mix. Yeah. But the reality was that we really sent our staff out and said, you need to do this. So make it happen. And whatever makes sense for your department. Obviously, those that are in the food department are going to develop very different networks than those that are in our clinic. Mm-hmm. So, but it was what was a surprising outcome of all that activity is because it brought all these volunteers in, and lots of universities and colleges and businesses that wanted to do good work in the community, sometimes for one day and sometimes for 2 years and sometimes for 6 weeks, whatever it was. One of the surprising outcomes of all that networking was that our program, you think of volunteers and quality of programs isn't very good. Actually, it really brought a lot of innovation to our organization that I could never have created, some of our staff couldn't have created, but came along because of these collaborative ideas that came together around these specialties. And a lot of quality that was brought to our programs that we could actually then measure in ways that we had never expected to be able to measure. Some outcomes that we, just surprised us. So, I guess all that to say, going back to this whole leadership model and how we do that, the importance of networking. And I think it speaks to your point, is to really spread that out. And to your point, a lot of our staff are, 20-something, 30-something, sort of used to that mindset anyway. Kind of makes sense for them to be really empowered to do that. And I think they've been excited about the results and things that they've been able to, and even short-term partnerships that have brought some wonderful components to the program that they've then continued. They said, this is so great, we got to keep it going, even though those folks, those students have now moved on, they finished their research project, but what they developed was so great, we got to keep it going. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. You're importing innovation and empathy from lots of different places. Well, so in the final couple minutes, you know, when we have these big conversations, it's always hard to figure out like what to take away and think about in terms of translating into your own practice. And so I'm going to ask Linda first and then others on the panel to just talk about that. You know, we've talked about some trends, we've talked about what works. How do you make that real in terms of your grant making advice for these folks?
I mean, the way that we have made it real is by, rather than creating, except in a couple of very limited situations, which I could talk about, we have put the choice in the hands of our grantees. What do they need? What are they trying to accomplish? And what is going to help them get there? And we don't parse a lot because they don't parse a lot. If it's leadership, I mean, it's called a Leadership Awards program, but we don't parse a lot whether it's called leadership or management because they need both. Or we don't parse whether it's external or internal, or it's just what do you need to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And it could be many different things, and it is different things at different times, and different groups that are, you know, very, you know, we fund very large national organizations as well as very small local grassroots groups. And so we really tried to come up with a model that supports them, both being very responsive and respectful to where they are, but also having some rigor about what it is they're trying to build and trying to bring both of those and being patient, you know, over time. So I think we have found that rather than creating something that obviously would have some kind of point of view about leadership or some kind of focus about leadership, that actually allowing the organization to develop its leadership in its own way and providing them money to help them do that has been a really powerful way to support groups. That said, because we have this bird's eye view, when something becomes so compelling, especially when they're coming to us saying the same thing about what's needed. So one example is we fund in the gay and lesbian movement. That's a very white movement, and it is not a white community. And so they really wanted a fellowship for people of color leaders in LGBT organizations to help both strengthen their leadership and bring them into leadership positions in those organizations. It's not the silver bullet that's going to solve the problem, but it's one thing that they asked for, and so that was a kind of need that came up as we were working with a lot of organizations that really can't be solved just on an organization by organization basis. So, I mean, I guess
deep
that's
listening and
I would
flexibility
kind of
is what I'm
turn the
hearing.
corner. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Well, so really quickly, in the final couple minutes, I wanted to give each of you the opportunity for a parting piece of advice, a parting comment, as you reflect on the conversation we've had today. And Rick, I'm going to make you go first.
So I think maybe funders are always this way, but maybe it's particularly around issues of leadership development. I think it's possible to fall in love with your own work and your own point of view to the extent that it's hard to listen to other perspectives and it's hard to imagine not doing it. And we did something really hard this year. We have an award called the Exponent Award that is $100,000 to 5 outstanding executive directors every year, and we've done it since 2006. And this year we said, wow, the world is really different than it was in 2006, and we're not getting any, well, much to our surprise, no one ever wrote back on their evaluation and said, wow, getting this $100,000 really sucked. So we only got positive feedback, yet we knew that the world is really different, and so we hired someone to go out and listen for us. And so we're in the process of doing a confidential survey of our grantees, and a really high-level consultant is talking to 20 executive directors in depth to try to get a handle on whether the award is really accomplishing what we had intended to, which was really hard for us because we were so in love with this piece of work.
And noble. Thank you, Rick. Heather, do you want
just a couple of parting comments. I think if you think about some of the things I was saying earlier about the shift in organizations to networks, and we're sort of living in a both-and world. I mean, if you think about the capabilities that I think leaders in our sector need, they need leadership skills, they need management skills, and increasingly they need these collaborative toolkits, right? The ability to not just work within organizational boundaries, but to bridge, to network. I mean, some of the millennials are doing this anyway, as Marian Haverhill pointed out. But if you look at the capabilities that we need, you know, adaptive and strategic, systems thinkers, collaborative, cross-sector, network leadership, not just organizational leadership. So from my point of view, I just feel like what I see is a whole lot of programs and a sector that is crying out and desperate for more investment in capacity building, collective capacity building, and leadership development at all levels of the organization. So I feel like we're program rich and in some ways kind of capacity poor in our sector. So I just see a need that's much bigger than the amount of funding that's being allocated to this right now. So I guess my hope and my encouragement for all of you is that you would think about creative and strategic ways that make sense in the context of your organization, in the context of the issues that you and your trustees care about, but to infuse some of that capital where it's needed.
Well, I know that there's Weingart and Annenberg and others locally have been talking about how to think about capacity building in a more collective way. So there's some great work already happening here in LA. Linda.
I guess I would say a few things. One is that if you're a funder, there's a power dynamic, no matter what, and no matter how close you are, and no matter how great a Gen Op funder you might be, or so I do think that, and if you're talking about something like leadership where people need to really be honest about their own weaknesses, you know, as well as their strengths, but their weaknesses organizationally and personally, there needs to be some buffer, somebody between you and them. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that it's messy. So if you want like a neat program model that's pretty linear, that's just not this work, and you probably shouldn't do it.
That's a great point.
And there's a real, what's complicated is in doing this work too, and I also think why you need that buffer is there's a real difference between presenting and real issues, and sometimes it's just hard for leader, you know, they might say the first thing they want is help with fundraising, and that might not be the thing that's going to help them the most. In fact, we found actually that it usually isn't. So there needs to be some process that kind of helps them think through. And you know, we fund not huge organizations, fairly small ones in the scheme of things. So I think that helping them tease out presenting versus real issues. And then the final thing I would say is that there has to be, on the one hand, I think the tone of we believe in you and we want to help you be successful is almost the most important thing about this work, that we respect where you are, we're appreciative of your work, and that doesn't mean that we're not going to also bring some real, you know, strategic and rigorous spirit alongside that. And balancing the two of those things is a real art, and that's another part of the work.
Lovely concluding remarks from all three of our panelists. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone in this room for such engagement and sophisticated comments and good interaction throughout the course of this conversation. And please join me in thanking our three esteemed panelists for their time.
Yes.